I am super pleased, really chuffed, and perhaps without wishing to sound too licky, I can say honoured to today welcome Professors Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, who I'll introduce properly in a second or two. Practice Research Assembly is supported by the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities, which is the world's first national graduate school in arts and humanities, which we're very proud of here in Scotland. All of these events have been beautifully organised by our research assistant, Katie Hart-Potapoff, who's currently undertaking a practice research Ph.D. in Dundee. So this afternoon's schedule is that the first half of the session will run approximately until about 4:15, then we'll have a wee short break, then we'll reconvene and then it'll run until about 5. Thanks to those of you who sent questions in advance, which we've collated. And please feel free to add any questions into the chat throughout, and we'll try to make a path through them. Can I remind everybody, as usual, to mute your mics, please? Feel free to keep your cameras on or off, depending on how you feel, whatever floats your boat. So by means of introduction, I'll begin with the opening passage of chapter Base Faith from Fred and Stefano's co-authored book, All Incomplete. The earth moves against the world. And today, the response of the world is clear. The world answers in fire and flood. The more the earth churns, the more vicious the world's response, but the earth still moves. Tanika Seeley Thompson might call it a procession. The earth's procession is not on the world's calendar. It is not a parade on a parade ground. It is not in the world's teleology. Nor is the procession exactly a carnival played to mock or overturn this parade to take over its grounds. A procession moves unmoved by the world. The earth's procession around which all processions move struts in the blackness of time. And the earthen who move around it and move in earth's procession, move, as Thompson says, like the sisters of good death in Bahia move in their own time, out of time. God is so powerful in this procession that he cannot exist, not because he's everywhere in the procession, but because we are. We are the moving, blackening earth. We turn each other, dig each other up, float each other off, sink down with each other and fall for each other. We move in earthen procession, swaying. And I'll just add to that a small little section from American artist Paul Tech's Teaching Notes for Four-Dimensional Design, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, a course that he taught at Cooper Union in the 1980s. And it's a very last little section. So there's a long list of kind of instructions or kind of quasi-instructions. And then at the end, Paul Tech says, remember, I'm going to mark you. These marks won't make much difference in your later life, but my reaction to you will. But the reactions of your classmates to what you will do. Your classmates are your world. Your future will be like this now, as related to your present. And you will relate to your future, recognize your weakness, and do something about it. Fred Moten is professor in the Department of Performance Studies, Tisch School of the Arts. Moten teaches courses and conducts research in Black Studies, Performance Studies, Poetics, and Critical Theory. He's the author of In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, Hughson's Tavern, B. Jenkins, The Feel Trio, The Little Edges, The Service Porch, a 3-volume collection of essays whose general title is Consent Not to Be a Single Thing, and All That is Beauty. Stefano Harney is Professor of Transversal Aesthetics, which is possibly one of the best job titles ever in the entire world, at the Academy of the Media Arts, Cologne. Harney is a teacher and writer who works collaboratively and collectively in the classroom, in research and in social practice. He's a Black Studies scholar who has taught in the disciplines of anthropology, sociology, art criticism, American studies, business and management. During 2000 to 2021, he was Hayden Fellow and Visiting Critic at the School of Art at Yale University and Honorary Professor at the Institute of Gender, Race, Sexuality and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. And as many of you I'm sure will be aware, together Moten and Harney have co-authored The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, A Poetics of the Undercommons and All Incomplete. So after that rather lengthy introduction, what I'm very happy to do is to begin some moments towards the conversation with some questions that we've received in advance. So if you bear with me while I just pull these up. So as I say, thank you so much for all of the questions that we received. We have got quite a lot, which is super. So what I've done is I've tried to kind of roughly collate them around some of the themes about collaboration, which will be discussed here today. And I'm going to begin with a very simple question. And we have the first names, Fred and Stefano, of the people who have submitted the questions. And really, this one is, I guess, quite personal to your own collaboration, which is, what are the problems of you working together?
Well, first of all, Maria, I just want to thank you so much for having us here. And thank you, Katie, for arranging everything, and thank all the, all the participants, in the seminar who have sent us such, really interesting and generous questions. And so we're really been looking forward to this conversation. The problems of working together, I know this was, well, I'll say it from my perspective. I don't know what Stefano would say. I just don't feel like we've ever really had any problems working together. So we always work together pretty well, and maybe that's, there have been, I would say, some obstacles sometimes that have to do with, that are just the practical obstacles that everybody faces about, where you live and being remote from one another and time gaps and being broke and, not being able to be in the same place as much as we would like. But in terms of like, and if there have ever been any problems, I would say they would be much more a function of maybe my temperament, which is not as calm and peaceful, and I tend to get pissed off and excited about stuff a lot of times, maybe, but I just don't feel like we've ever really had any problems working together, because we were friends for a long time before we worked together, so. But I don't know, what do you think?
I agree. I've never thought of our work in terms of problems until that question, which is a fair question, because certainly people face a lot of obstacles these days in trying to work together. But we just never had that. I think, as Fred said, partly because we were friends for a long time before we tried to work together. And then when we first started to work together, we started in a somewhat conventional way where people say, let's write together about something. In our case, it was, let's write together about the university as a workplace. And our very early writing together was concerned with that. And because it was a kind of conventional concern, I think it was a kind of conventional way of working together. And then at a certain point, we realized that that was just something we had to get out of the way to sort of, clear our heads or clear our desk or clear the air or whatever you want to say. And then the work became something else, which is much more about trying to help each other out of the kind of traps of individuation that that had been laid for us along the way in life, but even more maybe specifically in the field of academia, from graduate school into our first years as assistant professors and so on and so forth. So once we began to see that some of the work we had to do together was about that, helping each other out of that quite dangerous fantasy that we are individual intellects, or that we are sole critics or scholars in some particular kind of way, and then by extension, the way we teach, and and even sometimes, I guess, how we conduct the rest of our lives. We had to work on all that, and maybe I'm saying all that to say that that's maybe the one moment where you could use a word like difficulty or trouble or obstacle, but it wasn't because we had trouble working with each other. It's because it's difficult to work out of this fantasy of the individual scholar with the unique contribution and the searing critique and et cetera, et cetera. So it was actually made less difficult, which is again why I don't tend to think of it that way. And maybe necessarily so by doing it together, because I think one thing we established pretty early on is that you can't help yourself out of this trap of individuation. You need help. It's like our friend Dylan Rodriguez says about abolitionism. You can't be an abolitionist by yourself. And so if we were serious about trying to escape this trap of individuation, we really needed each other. And unfortunately, we had each other. So there were difficulties, but they weren't difficulties, with us.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to hear that you both get on well together. That's always very nice to hear. Can you say a little bit about the actual collaborative writing process?
Well, as Stefano said, when it began, it was a more conventional, we were asked by a great friend and mentor of ours named Randy Martin, great sociologist and dancer and dance studies scholar who passed away a few years ago, and whom we still very much miss. But he sort of gave us the chance to co-author an article about academic labor. And I think we both maybe approached it, as a kind of opportunity to do something called co-authoring, and I don't know if we knew what we were doing. I don't know that we knew that there was a particular, method for doing so that which we were supposed to adhere. And I think we probably didn't, on the one hand, we probably were trying to conform to some unspoken ideal about what that meant, and obviously also to operate within an already existing framework of what it meant to properly publish something, and to prepare something for proper publication. But I think there was already something going on in the collaboration that was straining against that, those protocols. And what I would say over the course of, so the real problem was, how do you translate hanging around, drinking, watching soccer while we were also talking about Marx? How do you put that on paper? How do you make that into something that could seem academically, legitimate? And I think we probably tried, to a certain extent. And then at a certain point, we're like, well, no, we're not going to try. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to make our writing as much like our hanging out and talking as possible. And admittedly, it's a kind of a weird, particular form of hanging out and talking, but that's what it is. and then over the course of time, and when we started, we had the good fortune of, that was one of the few times over the last, since we met in college, and we're able to hang out pretty much every day for a couple of years. And then there was a gap. But then in the late 90s, early 2000s in New York City, we were also in the same city. And so a lot of the writing was stuff that we could be in the same place to work on it. And but most of our relationship has been one of correspondence, of first it was letters, and Stefano was always much better about writing letters, but we both learned a really good postcard habit from our mentor and friend, Bill Corbett, and we also learned, I think, a good kind of corresponding and also sharing habit from our other mentor, Martin Hughson, who was always sending us letters or sending that he had written to somebody else or sending us text that he was working on, and so we shared stuff that we were working on. We developed a good kind of practice of corresponding, and then that was accelerated and accentuated by email. So we have the email correspondence and the writing correspondence. Sometimes Stephanie just sends me something he's working on for something else, and I'll send him some notes I'm taking for something else, and we just start messing with it. It's like we, I if I were to describe it, it just I realized once my partner Laura Harris and once our children were born, that it turned out that a lot of the way that we were working was kind of the way that my kids played together. They just share toys, they share paper. One start drawing on something and the other one would draw on it, or do something else with it. So that's pretty much, I think, how we work. And then if there's another problem, as you'll already see, that I start thinking about it and I start talking and I don't particularly know when to shut up. So that's the other thing is maybe the other problem is I talk too much, and he doesn't talk enough or something. I don't know. It feels like that to me sometimes. So I just start blathering on and I don't know when to shut up, like right now. So I'm just put myself in mute and I'll keep talking.
Maybe the one other thing I would add to that is that Fred and his partner Laura Harris always been great hosts, and I've often been a person who had an opportunity in my life to travel and visit. So episodically through the years, I've come and stayed with them for shorter or longer periods of time, and during that time, we have these very intense, but also these very elongated conversations that might occur over the course of the day as we're doing other things, etc. And I bring that up because that kind of hosting and talking, is also a more general principle for us of working, not just with each other, but more generally. And again, our mentors, the mentors that were already mentioned, as well as others we haven't come to yet, we're all amazing examples of hosts. Professor Marion and Martin Hughson, Beverly Corbett and Bill Corbett, and their tables were places of study. And so I think a big part of the way we work is through this sort of visitation and hosting. And I know that we've been thinking more and more about generalizing that practice and some of what we're doing now, which maybe we can talk about a little later.
Thank you. So an undercurrent that's been common to a lot of the questions that we received so far is trying to reach a stable kind of shape of, I was going to say definition, but I think definition's the wrong phrase for it, something more like a shape, let's say, of collaboration. And I guess what I would like to add to that is thinking about what the difference between cooperation and collaboration is, and thinking about correspondence and sharing and hosting and so forth. They could also be seen, I guess, as cooperative activities, and whether that's a useful, well, I think what's probably more important bit of that question is getting a kind of a shape for collaboration, and whether there is a useful definition to maybe between cooperation and collaboration.
Well, you know, I mean, to collaborate is just to work with someone, you know, to labor with someone, and you know, one interesting thing is to basically, I'm as my students all hear all the time and probably get sick of, I'm like a really I'm not a religious person, but if there is a church that I would belong to, it would be like the church of etymology. You know, so like I just love to look up words and get the history of those words and try to understand something about what the words, not just what they mean, but where they come from, and what meanings have been lost and or covered over, you know, and so and obviously, you know, there's a simple, you know, root sort of etymological connection between collaborate and elaborate, you know. They diverge in all these ways, but to you know, sometimes people say, you know, to elaborate is, you know, to build something up from a simple to a more complex sort of structure or shape. And I think that what we're doing is probably some variation, you know, on collaboration and elaboration, and you know, try to begin with some, you know, be concerned with really basic questions. And I guess my sense of it, at least, is, you know, the basic questions that we've been concerned with are, you know, how can we live better? You know, how can we survive? How can we sustain some kind of, you know, pleasurable existence in the face of extreme viciousness and brutality? And then at the same time, that question kind of corresponds or is all entangled with the question of, you know, well, more generally, and maybe more, you know, something that approaches a philosophical question would be like, well, how does stuff go together? You know, like, how, you know, and I say it in that way because I think it's a more precise term than maybe the more interested and elaborated, you know, so to speak, kind of philosophical or ontological or metaphysical kinds of questions that emerge from that. You know, it's really just like how does stuff go together? It's a question about description. You know, it's like, I mean, I'm just sitting there, I'm fascinated by wherever Stefano is, and I'm looking at those windows behind you and that building, and you're in a courtyard, but it's a beautiful background, you know, and there's that little, you know, there's a piece of a plant that's behind you, Maria, and I just really want to know, I would love to move there, you know, somehow virtually, because I want to see where that plant's coming from and where it's going. And I don't know if it starts on the, you know, I mean, those are the questions, you know, how is it that what we approach, how is it that what we encounter, how is it put together? How does it go together? You know, is there a way to know that and to celebrate that without brutalizing it? Is there a way to resist the vicious sort of forces that, you know, I mean, sorry to use technical philosophical language, but that fuck up, you know, how stuff goes together, you know, and those are the questions that we've, you know, and so, you know, one way to consider it, to come to us, to is, what if it turns out that practice for us is not only, you know, an activity, but it's also a condition, right? The collaborate practice is our condition, right? Which doesn't ameliorate or get rid of the ethical questions of how we practice. But even if we were to dispense with the ethical questions of how we practice together, which is, let's say, what capital does, they dispense with those, they dispense with the ethical question of how we practice together. But even if they dispense with the ethical question of how we practice together, practicing together remains our condition. Okay. Capital chooses to exploit that practice together, and to brutalize that practice together, and to monetize that, you know, but in terms of like how to do it better for its own sake, has no interest in that question whatsoever, right? It shapes the terms and conditions under which we, you know, operate within that question. So I do not use that blue ball back there very much at all. Those are my our eldest son's blue balls, and he bounces all over the room. He's kind of like a blue ball Tigger in that respect, you know. Sorry, I just got a direct message from Simon Whitehead, who's at, you know, so it's like I guess he sent it to me privately, but I'm making it public, Simon, sorry. But anyway, again, this is another one of those instances in which I should.
Simon preempted my question, Fred, which was what seat you're sitting on, actually. I think you evoked that question from thin air. Stefan.
Yeah, I think everything Fred's saying is something that we've been pursuing now for a long time, not least of which under some kind of notion of the practice of means, which I think we suggested as a title, because for a long time we've been sort of paying attention to the general degradation of means that one finds under capitalism in the first instance, but probably even especially it feels more apparent to us, perhaps even more widespread since the rise of what you might call logistical capitalism, and certainly the problems of logistics within our current moment. Because as you know, your first impulse when you see logistics is to say to yourself, "Wow, it's all about means. Everything is about how you move this from here to there, et cetera, et cetera." But gradually, because you start to realize the narrowness of the ends, you see also that the means are being deeply degraded because they're put to such limited use, and they are themselves restricted in so many ways, such that limited use is not doesn't face deviation or dilution or challenge. And so I think that counterintuitively, it's important to say that the rise of logistics is the degradation of means, not the ubiquity of it. And therefore it's left to us, as Fred says, to say, okay, well that's a condition, that's the pressure we're under. But how do we want to use the word we were using earlier, elaborate on means? And I think it's one thing that it's one reason that Fred was talking about how things go together. I have an uncle who's a contemporary painter. He teaches at an art school in Massachusetts, and he's a wonderful collage artist. And I've watched him sometimes move around pieces on the canvas. But even more recently, I had the experience that I went to a show of his, and several of his students who are now themselves professional painters came to the show with little bags, and inside the bags were little pieces of cloth, little pieces of colored paper that they had kept since being in a collage class with him many years ago. And I've been thinking about that practice of teaching, and that has naturally as teachers ourselves. But I've also been thinking about the ways Fred and I are, our own writing has become more collage, right? And I think part of what is at stake in collage is a kind of calling into question of the separation of means and ends, in the way that something is assembled, made, collage, etc. It's very clear that the means of composition is foregrounded and so important in such work. Anyway, no art history lessons here, but just a feeling that our work is moving more in that direction. There's a kind of intuitive sense that something should be assembled one way and maybe not another way, and that's an experiment, but it's an experiment that's not entirely open. It starts to establish its own needs, its own rules as it goes. So
I'm thinking about sticky and stuck down edges. We've got a nice warm nest of questions around reading practices. So I'm kind of going to squash them together a little bit. I hope that's okay with the people who kindly sent them in. So from Joe and Fred about collaborative kind of reading and the practicalities, I suppose, of that, but more extensively, I'll just read out one of the questions from Fred. I think it covers quite a lot of the concerns here. As we work together, envisaging forms of study as commoning practices that evade capture and co-option by, for instance, the university structures. How do we maintain forms of reading and writing that remain resistant to extractive reading practices? So I guess occlusion and so forth. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I think that well, so sometimes it feels like a question like that is well, I think that the beauty and the potential of a question like that is in that it allows us to maybe recognize that the kinds of reading that we might have already been engaged in and which we might have thought of as being done under the aegis or by way of the commitment to some kind of decoloniality or anti-blackness or whatever, it allows us to kind of consider how even those motivated reading practices might in fact be extractive, right? In other words, I don't believe that there is some simple distinction to be made between, non-extractive reading practices, which are non-extractive because we wish that they were so, and extractive reading practices, which are the practices of reading that are engaged in by the people that we don't like because they're so vicious, mean, and evil, right? So what's at stake is to continually try to refine, you know, our practices of reading, right? And if what we want is a non-extractive reading practice, then we have to work for that rather than just act like it's a matter of saying so, you know? That, in other words, that would require a fundamentally, a radical revision of reading, of the very idea. And that's where we would, you know, that's where we would have to begin. And then the question would be, well, how are extractive reading practices learned? How are they inculcated? What are the structures of education? You know, I mean, we could have a Department of Postcolonial Studies or a Department of African American Studies or Afro-diasporic Studies, which puts on its mission statement, you know, we are engaged in, you know, we are offering a critique of extraction and extractivism, and we refuse to engage in practices of extractivism. And then, of course, you know, but by the same token, we still have exams, and we still have tests, and we still have assignments, you know, and we still make people read, you know, 2 books a fucking week, you know, for class, you know, all of which are designed to produce modalities of reading that can't be anything other than extractive, right? Okay, so the question of extractive reading, you know, non-extractive reading practices those are questions about the, you know, the protocols of how one does that, you know. And of course, I'm framing it within as a sort of question interior to academia, but it's not interior to academia. You know, the review sections of The Guardian or of the New York Times or of Le Monde are all engaging in extractive reading practices. So, or whatever, you know, the average Bible study class, you know, in South Carolina, in you know, is those are forms of extractive reading, right? You know, the habit of saying a Bible verse before you get ready to eat your dinner, you know, has its origins, I think, in a certain kind of extractive reading practice, which is very much bound up with, you know, the establishment of certain modes of authority. So that's a question that gets us back to the question of reading, how to read, right? It's not a question that assumes that we know the right way to read. It's a question that raises the question that we should answer collaboratively or address collaboratively. How should we read? So.
Thank you.
There's something that maybe we can learn about reading in general from thinking about how reading has evolved in universities, maybe even more particularly in graduate school. And maybe get at some of the persistence of its extractive qualities. And that, you know, that for me and for Fred and for Tanika Seeley Thompson, who you mentioned earlier, because she and I have tried to conduct these reading camps, is all bound up with the way we have privatized reading in a certain way. Now, by that, we're not saying that you shouldn't sit by yourself and read under a tree, but rather something else. How did reading get so tied to shame in graduate school? How did it get so tied to shame, right? Reading's related to shame in graduate school. You're ashamed to admit you didn't read it or you didn't understand it. And it's something that's supposed to occur behind the back of graduate school. You're somehow just supposed to show up and you will have read it or you will know it. And once again, if that's not the case, the shame of the private takes over it. There's no moment in reading that really allows for not understanding, not knowing the way we structure it. It's all there for explication, and the connection between explication and extraction is pretty clear. So one of the things that seems important is for reading to, you know, to develop a renewed sociality, one that occurs at the point of production, not later on when we're consuming it, you know, in the conference or graduate seminar. And how we read together, what place we put on reading as a I don't want to say public act, but as a social act. And once again, that social act doesn't mean you can't do it by yourself. It has to do with a certain comportment towards what you're doing. And at the moment, graduate school very much works against all that, towards some idea that you should have already done the reading somewhere else before you show up, and towards the idea that any lack of comprehension or thoroughness in doing that reading is a matter for shame or shaming. And so I think there are clues offered to us in the very bad way that we read in graduate school that could help us to think about how we might read other ways. When I say very bad way, I mean, we're all complicit in it, whether we're teaching a seminar that we can maybe not at the same level, but nonetheless, it's a common problem.
Thank you. Lingering for a bit more around this, there's a question from Adam in the chat here, which is, does collaboration necessarily heighten responsibility of the actors involved by understanding the collective conditions in which knowledge are formed? And so the sense of care for those around us who with us who are studying, I guess, or is this the shaking off of isolated senses of culpability and or achievement?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, again, it's like a great question, because it's one of those questions that gives us a chance to really consider the terms, and the definitions of the question. It's like worth studying for a long time, and it makes you want to. Can we revise the question? I can't answer it, but can we revise it? Can we sharpen it? Can we make it, and so I would say, I don't know if it heightens responsibility. If what responsibility implies is a kind of individuated sort of moral accounting, but my sense of it is that certainly it heightens, or maybe a better word would be deepens, responsiveness, right? Where, responsiveness is not so much about, the sort of, the interactions on the one-to-one level, but maybe there's just a general increase in sensitivity, the term that another of our friends and mentors would use, Denise Ferreira de Silva, would be affectability. We are both rendered more affectable, in the collaboration, but and we are also, more cognizant, more of that general affectability. Now that greater cognizance ought to, it ought to lead to care. It ought to lead, to an awareness of the general affectability, not just mine, right? But that what I do, what operates within that general affectability. And over the course of time, I think what might be approached is not a better way for this or that subject to go about his moral business, right? But actually a refusal of that individual moral accounting, right? you know, and what it would mean would be, and you know, the primary way in which moral accounting seems to operate within academic discourse is through, you know, acknowledgement or citation, you know, but that's, you know, citation is a modality of policing and intellectual property management that displaces the actual work of reading and writing together. It displaces the actual pleasures and you know, responsibilities of engagement. You know, it's all based on the idea of individual intellectual property. You know, and you know, to acknowledge someone, to acknowledge a writer or a colleague or a source, you know, that's all operating within a general sort of ethics of extraction, you know, and it's, you know, there's these ways that people say, you know, I draw on the work of so and so and so and so, and they say that because they want to acknowledge those people's ownership of that work. And it's like, okay, but in drawing on it, what's the difference between drawing on it and extracting from it? You know, at which point, so isn't the most vicious and brutal moment of extraction the imposition of ownership in the first place that constitutes the ground for the extraction, right? You know, so that's just Proudhon, right? It's, you know, theft is, property is theft, you know, so, you know, now, at the same time, of course, there's this brutal history of stealing, right? But the brutal history of stealing is a function of the equally brutal history of the imposition of ownership and of those boundaries that constitute the ontological ground, so to speak, of ownership. So, you know, then there's just this condition / practice of sharing, you know, which is study, you know. And I don't know, I guess it's weird, you know, maybe it seems contradictory. We don't believe in citation and we don't believe in intellectual property and we don't believe in the ownership of intellectual property, but our mouths are full of the names of our friends who we study with. So maybe sometimes that seems like but I would just say when we mention our friends, it's not because we're citing them. It's because they're with us all the time, you know, I guess. Maybe that's I don't know. It's probably not sharp enough of a distinction to seem rigorous, but that's pretty much what we got, you know.
I'm teaching a seminar this semester called Aesthetics of Collectivities at the new place where I'm teaching, which is this really cool art school in Cologne called KHM, Academy of Media Arts. And we started the class, and it was like 30 minutes into the class before the students had already convinced me that I gave the class the wrong title. And then we had to completely revise it and say, okay, well, our aim is actually not to understand collectivities. Our aim is going to be to think about what the limits of collectivity is as a way of designating a practice and working together. And part of that is the reasons that you would all be familiar with, things like the fact that collectivity, still a collective in particular, still suggests a membership. So it still suggests that it's come together because a set of individuals have decided to work together, to collaborate or to cooperate. And it puts me in mind of how much, as Fred was saying earlier, you know, we're prisoners of a certain kind of language of the possessive individual as it's emerged in the West and as it's emerged specifically in academic discourse, but just also generally in our language. Like even what Maria was reading in the beginning, there's a part of it where Fred and I are saying each other, each other, each other, which is not really what we would want to say if we had other words for it. Because, and now actually, I think Fred has steered us more towards this term all in an interesting way. And now, ever since he steered us that way, I see all over the place. I was just back studying. We were studying a collective as part of this class. We were back studying the Red Thread Collective in Guyana, and we were reading one of the founders of it, a great Guyanese feminist intellectual, and Daya, whose collection of essays has come out thanks to another great scholar of the younger generation from Guyana called Alyssa Charles, whom we also watched give a really great sort of lecture conversation online in the comments. But I was struck by how many times Daya uses the term all rather than every or each. Times the poet Martin Carter, which is where Fred first pointed it out, how often he uses all, how often Alyssa Charles uses all. That's all to say that there are ways for us to not to let the language win when it comes to the problem of the way in which it keeps referring back to the individual and the subject and the object, and ways in which we can try to overcome it. And I think collective is one of those words that we like and we use all the time, but I think we have to maintain a healthy suspicion about whether it is furthering something like collaboration and cooperation, or whether it is framing it in a certain way so that it can't go further. And it may just be that, you know, something else has to start to collect in a collective besides members for us to make the next step.
Thank you.
No, can I say one about all? Because the great literary critic William Empson has a great essay on the word all, and that I was, you know, and especially interested in the way Milton uses the word all in Paradise Lost, and I was remembering it, you know, because my dissertation director, Julian Boyd, was very adamant in teaching me that the distinction between a word like all and a word like every, as in everyone, right? For him, all was a mass word as opposed to a count word, right? That for Julian, all was a word that, you know, resists individuation. It resists calculation. And then I just remember, Steve, man, that like Zhukovsky's, the little version of Zhukovsky's collected poems that weren't part of A, right? The little Norton anthem. Now there's a big collective, but the little volume of it that was in the poetry room where we worked in college, that the title of it was All, you know? And I guess, and then of course we have been so influenced and touched by another of our mentors and friends, Cedric Robinson, and the phrase of his, all incomplete, you know, which is the title of our last book. So, and that's the key, is this fundamental relation between all and incompleteness, you know, because at the end of the day, all's just a word too. It doesn't, it feels like it gets us closer to where we want to go than everyone or than everything, but it's not like it's there, you know, and these words, we love these words, and we play with these words, and they're part of how we practice, but they don't have any kind of definitive, you know, relation or correspondence to what it is that we're trying to approach. They are modalities of approach, but they are not modalities of arrival, or of capture. And the minute you start to think that they've captured anything, the words themselves usually have the courtesy to disappear.
Are those modalities of approach habits?
Well, there's so much kind of cool energy, you know, in the field that is created by, you know, whatever, the proximity of practice, habit, you know, ritual, sacrament, you know, and of course, this is also influenced very much by this kind of great habit that I've been involved in for the last 8 weeks, which is teaching a class where I teach on the performance of everyday life. That's the title of the class, and it's kind of horrible, right? It's a class called The Performance of Everyday Life, but we only meet once a week. But it's as if that once a week has become every day. It's like, or it's as if we meet on Wednesday, but Wednesday has become a Sunday, right? Like a day of rest or recess, or a day of study, a day of contemplation, you know, and the rest of the week is just what we get through in order to get to Sunday, which is interesting because it ends up being very much like, I think in a lot of ways, but then I started thinking, no, that's not it. It's not that the rest of the week doesn't matter anymore. It's rather that it's not that you subordinate the rest of the week to Sunday. It's that the contemplation that one engages in on Sunday starts to become the structure through which we understand the rest of the days of the week, right? That we're trying to find the sacrament everywhere, right? Against the grain of the brutalities of, you know, of what I guess you would call the work week, you know, of the way in which the week, the way in which the natural cycle, if you want, or even the artificial cycle, the way in which it has been overdetermined by, again, by extraction, by the logic, you know, of extraction. And so, so how does a thing become a habit? How does it become a practice? How does it become a sacrament? Well, it becomes, again, in other words, how does the practice become a condition? You know, I don't have an answer as much as but I believe there's something really cool about the continual elaboration of the question in practice together, right? And at a certain point, you got to get so committed to that you really are willing to resist to the point of, you know, you're really willing to resist and to risk everything, right, in the name of all, right? And you just like unsatisfied anymore with not working, with not practicing like that, right? That I don't want to, you know, I mean, you know, I just refuse to not, you know, we collectively refuse whatever the hell it is that keeps us from practicing that way, you know, all the time. So.
Stefano, have you anything to add to that?
Whenever we hear this word practice now, this word habit, we think of our Sermon Callahan's use of the phrase renewing our habits of assembly, and And I know Callahan himself was a student of Heighten, who also speaks about his the ability to assemble. And I guess so. One thing I want to add is that we have to do a lot of this under duress, under conditions in which, as Fred was talking about, the work week or whatever it might be, where it's really a lot harder than it looks. It's similar to when we elaborate ideas of study, and someone says, well, that it's fine to get together and study, but what's your political practice? But if you really try to get together to study, you discover there are all kinds of antagonisms. You don't need to have politics or political practice, because the antagonisms come to you immediately when you try to elaborate some themes together. And so too with the more general notion of assembly. In fact, we were saying the other day that, returning and reviewing, the different sort of understandings of the modern state, whether it's the Weberian understanding of the monopoly on violence or a Marxist understanding of the sorting of public and private property, etc. And of course, in the hemisphere that Fred and I are from, neither of those things ever made any sense. Many people have pointed out. There's obviously never been a monopoly on violence from the state when it comes to the Caribbean or South America or the American West or pretty much anywhere else. And obviously there's been the niceties of private and public have rarely been observed either. Not that Marxists believe they were truly nice, but nonetheless, it seems that the one monopoly the state seems to have maintained for 500 years in our hemisphere is a monopoly on gathering. You can gather, but you have to gather under its terms. And for 500 years, there have been constant refusals of those terms of engagement. And we're students of those resistances, of the fact that people have managed to gather anyway in all kinds of forms, despite the interdiction of the state. So of all the habits, that's the habit that feels closest to our practice. Just the habit of getting together on our own terms. And part of that means, questioning the very idea of our own terms, and beginning to see that itself is a phrase that still has in mind somebody else's terms. It's a dominant reference. So we take inspiration from people who seem, to have gathered in ways that don't take their reference from the monopoly, and those are the habits that we keep trying to form, and then as Fred says, we'd like to see become conditions.
Thank you. That feels like a good place to pause for a little break, and thank you all for your many observations and questions, which we can all see in the chat. And maybe I'll just end. There's an observation here from Kate. Kate, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly with a fada on it, so excuse me if I'm not. Is this the way of, this observation really, is this the way of letting our practice become conditioned, connected to our care, our affectability? So is our care active always with for all, because we're open to affect, stay in relation, and I suppose because it matters just because it matters to all. So with that observation, perhaps we'll take a little break. So we'll see everybody back in 10 minutes or so. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. So we've got until about 5 p.m. It's starting to get dark in Scotland now. I was looking a bit spooky earlier, so I've changed the lighting to make me look slightly less spooky. We're going to return to questions. Please keep adding questions to the chat here. I'm going to, I've pulled out, extracted, if you will, some questions that were sent before and sort of put them together. And the first one I'd like to pull forward has to do with debt. And that's a question from Michael. And Michael says, I'm particularly interested in your idea of debt and how that needs to be reconceptualized. And how do you see a remodeling of debt being useful in collaborative research?
Well, thank you for that question. And it's been on our minds a lot too recently, because we've been trying to make more of a connection between debt and gathering, and thinking about the way gathering can enhance an unpayable debt that we can share, but also that can be the principle of our gathering. It can come to be a kind of fetish for our gathering, in the sense of
Stefano, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but we couldn't hear any of the last bit there that you said because of the background noise. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Would you mind if repeating whatever returns back to yourself of that?
Not at all. I'm not sure where I kind of cut out, but we've been thinking about the relationship between debt and gathering, and been thinking about the ways in which debt can become a principle for gathering, or even, if you like, maybe something like a fetish in the classic sense of a way to see something that's too complex to see, but as a way to gather around some agreed form of society. So it's very much in our mind, these forms of debt, and of course they can be practiced in these very small ways, as well as in this kind of larger forms of gathering. And I think research is a place, and writing is a place for that takes place. And I think it comes back to Fred's question, Fred's answer around the question of citation. Can debt be an alternative to property when it comes to citation?
Buon aperitivo. Se è veloce, lo faccio subito sì. Bene.
So we did something. We were meeting on Zoom with some friends that we made virtually in Chile a couple of days ago, and we've done a lot of Zoom stuff over the last couple of years. And I think we've just been lucky, sort of touched by the angel of Zoom to make it so that the technical difficulties haven't been so bad. But they were kind of bad the other day, and they're not so good today. But let's, and it's annoying, right? It's annoying. But it reminds me of another mentor and friend of ours, Nathaniel Mackey, in the way he talks about the notion of an enabling disability. Okay, and sometimes, it's funny, right? It's like on a scholarly occasion, you want to have clarity, you want to have a certain kind of definitive, kind of clarity about what's been said, it's a place to valorize the constitutive over the performative, in a certain kind of way. But if we were, I'm not saying it would be a good work of art, but if we were to think about the whole thing as a work of art, then all of a sudden you're like interested in all these different sound textures and interested in the various forms of feedback and erasure that you know, and people speaking these little snippets of Italian, and the publicness of this attempt to speak, you know, and it's, you know, we all talk critically, talk a lot of shit about the university, but then of course, one of the cool things about the university is it's relatively quiet, you know, so so if there's something that you wanted to hear somebody say, they got places where you can go and have a really good chance of hearing them say exactly what the hell it is you don't have to deal with the outside noise of the world, you know, and the feedback and all of that, all those complications of communicability that make communication more simple, you know. But now I'm saying all that because yesterday I had to give a interview about this beautiful book. For me, you know, maybe one of the 2 or 3 most important books of my adulthood as a reader, you know, Song by Norbesi Philip, the great Tobagan poet. And you know, a whole lot of Zong is about it. What some of it shows up initially as unreadability, but what it really is like, again, as we spoke of before, it's an occasion to rethink the very idea of reading, and to rethink the very idea of reading and writing. But it's also a place to rethink certain terms like debt, you know, and also another term that came up in the questions that y'all sent us, Maria, about another term that I think came from Catherine's questions regarding, and then it was also in the chat, this term acknowledgement, you know. So I've been like, you know, and again, I have to go to the online etymology dictionary every day, you know, like people go to mass, you know. So today I was going to acknowledgement, and acknowledge is a totally interesting word. It's got an interesting history, but when we think about acknowledgement, first of all, it's very much bound up with debt, right? You know, people usually think that the acknowledgements, you know, of a book, let's say, or citation as a modality of acknowledgement, right? That it's about the acknowledgement of a debt. It's a way of marking a thing that is owed, okay? And that is the meaning of the term, but it seems like historically, prior to that, there's a more basic sort of meaning, you know, which is interesting, which is to acknowledge is to admit that one knows. Okay, so it's not just that you are acknowledging that you owe this debt, you're also acknowledging that you know that you owe this debt. Okay, so that there's a self-reflexivity to the notion of acknowledgement before it becomes what people want to think of as a relational term, right? I know I owe. Well, what do you owe? I know that I owe this thing that I know to someone else. That's basically, you know, I know that I owe this thing that I know to someone else. I know that I owe this thing that I know to someone else who owns it. Well, that's when it gets tricky, right? You know you owe this thing that you know to the person who owns that knowledge. But of course, the person who owns that knowledge is already himself or herself in a chain of similar acknowledgement. No one owns anything that we know. You know, for those of us who believe in the necessity and the absolute, you know, righteousness of refusing the very idea of private property, the most immediate place in which that refusal has to be carried out is in the notion that what we know, that anything that we know is private and can be owned that way. But then the really fucked up tricky thing about acknowledgement as a word is if you look at the etymology, it's like there's a moment in the dictionary, you know, I saw where they say something like, you know, there's a moment at which there's a little, it's all about what it is to know, and what it is to owe, and what it is to own, are all tangled up with one another. And there's this weird moment where there's a reference to some, 15th century English text in which the word own, okay, is spelled O-W-E-N-D, right? As if O and own are together in some prior entanglement before, you know what I mean? It's like, so I guess, what am I trying to say? And then I'm going to teach a class on the word acknowledgement or on acknowledgement. That's what I'm going to do, someday soon. And the text for the class will be the first movement of John Coltrane's A Love Supreme, which is acknowledgement. Okay. Now, if we could figure out this problematic of owing and owning and knowing by way of a close and attendant listening to the actual practical elaboration of that very problem in Coltrane, we might get somewhere. If nothing else, we would have some fun. We would have experienced some pleasure, and it would be pleasure that would exist as a function of a certain kind of difficulty, of a certain set of, conventions of elaboration that certainly go against the norm, go against the grain of normal compositional practice, of normal saxophone playing. It would be a modality of practice that is so deep and so committed that it's against the grain even of normal conceptions of virtuosity, right? Like, I don't think Train was interested in virtuosity. He was interested in gathering and sharing, and so I believe, we need to, if there's anything, we need to extract ourselves from the metaphysical foundations of the idea of private property. That's what we need to do, okay? And as long as we continue to engage in these well-meaning pieties regarding acknowledgement, citation, and so forth, then we will never have extracted ourselves from, the regimes of the metaphysical foundations of the regime of private property. We will simply be doubling down, okay, on the very structures that have produced our degradation and our brutalization. Our brutalization, the brutalization of the theft of our having been stolen and of our having been stolen from, okay, is not resisted, okay, by way of our appeals, to private property. They had to, in the same way that the slave's humanity has to be posited in order for the operations of dehumanization to take place. Similarly, the slave's ownership of him or herself has to be posited in order for the operations of theft to take place, right? And that means that abolition is a counter-philosophical, under-philosophical project, okay, as much as it is also, sometimes a project of military resistance, sometimes a project of, aesthetic insurgency, right? It's also always like, we can't think like those fuckers thought, right? To get ourselves out of this, right? It's, like Hughie says, this is the hard work of decolonizing what one might call the collective mind, right? Okay, is that even the terms that you appeal to in order to try to get free, like for instance, the word free, even those terms have to be called into question.
Yeah.
All of them do. There is no term whose etymology we ain't supposed to be looking up. We have to, luckily we're nerds, right? So we like to do that kind of shit,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. I wonder with there are a couple of questions, Fred. I want to bring in, and I hope Stefan will be able to rejoin us in a minute. Oh, hello, Stefan. I was just reflecting on clarity there, and wondering if clarity is in fact greed, if they're intrinsically linked with each other. There are a couple of questions in the chat that I want to make sure that we include. And I'm going to go to the second one first and then the first one second, if you see what I mean. So there's a wee question here from Francis. I'm particularly interested in the operation of confusion in your collective writing, a collaborative writing as an affect, perhaps being confused as a way of refusing extraction, and as an action way of circumscribing movement. So Francis is saying what you're saying right now, past tense, Fred, really speaks to this against valorization and clarity. And I'd like to know more about the way in which a different genre, medium, expectation shifts what this means to confuse or be confused.
I'll just take this minute while they stop making spritzes here in Milano for a minute, and see if I can't be heard and hopefully confused. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind in that really rich question is, you know, one of Fred and I practice a kind of confusion. I mean, we don't know who wrote what or who thought what or who said what, you know, and that's something that, you know, is on purpose, but it's also something that's accidental if you can work closely enough together and begin to break down those borders, and then, you know, sort of natural confusion occurs. And I agree with what I take to be some of the impulse behind the question, that a little confusion is a good thing. And especially given the you know, all of us at one point received something back where someone said this needs to be clearer, you know, or this needs to be more explicit, or whatever, you know, the helpful comments might be. And so you know, confusion is then tied up with all these other things, response capacity, this idea of Hartman's obscurity, et cetera, we think worth considering in our practice.
It's, again, it's the word itself is a beautiful word, right? Confuse. Because if you think about it, on first glance, it feels like a redundancy. It's a because fuse, you know, is implies a kind of joining, but that prefix con, usually, you know, coming out of Latin words is with, right? So it's like a double word, right? It like doubles down on itself, fuse and with, you know, it's like to confuse is like to join, to with, you know, you know, it's like a, but then you know, you look up the word and it, in the dictionary I use, they talk about confuse having a doublet, right? It's got a twin. There's a hidden twin to the word confuse, and that is confound. Which is totally interesting because found comes from, you know, this Latin root fund, you know, which is, you know, we think about that word now in financial terms, but fund as in pouring, outpouring, right? A kind of pouring out with, you know, and eventually it's all about mixing. It's all about mixing, right? This, you know, the image in my mind when I think of the word confound in its etymological sort of richness is like mixing paint, like mixing colors, you know, or something. But sorry, I'm just blathering like a mad scientist or something. But what I guess I'm trying to get at is, look, you know what? So part of the thing is that Stefano and I, our friendship grew out of, well, it's complicated, right? Like, it's complicated, you know, and confuse and complicate, they're not far away from each other, those terms either, right? But we met because we were on a literary magazine together in college, and we both loved poetry. And I would like, you know what? In one way you could think about it, you'd be like, I grew up reading and listening to Black poetry. Most of the Black poetry I grew up reading and listening to, most of the Black poetry I grew up around, I listened to it before I read it, or even in and I feel like maybe Steve came to our friendship with a knowledge of a kind of tradition, experimental tradition in American poetry. And then, of course, what we realize is that the experimental tradition in American poetry and Black poetry were a perfect confusion. They were a perfect co-founding and confounding, right? That they were inseparable from one another. And of course, the figure who constituted or sort of symbolized that inseparability was Amiri Baraka for us, you know, but who is the point of intersection of Black poetry and experimental American poetry for us. But why am I saying all this? The point is that, you know, within both of those traditions, clarity was way more, was subordinate to precision. And precision was cognate with confusion, right? And also the other part about it is that in both of those traditions and in their confounding of and with one another, orality was key. The poems that we loved were poems that were meant to be heard and read aloud and shared, and not just read inside your head in that way that Stefano was talking about at the very beginning. These are poems that were meant to be shared and read aloud. And I believe that they were also even more fundamentally meant to be shared and read aloud within the context of a general confusion, a general confounding, a general openness to interruption, right? Like one of the greatest poetry readings I've ever heard. I know you heard it too, man. Remember the reading Charles Olson gives at the big Berkeley Poetry Conference in 1965? It takes him like an hour and 20 minutes to read one poem because he's interrupting himself and the people in the audience are interrupting. And so let's say if there were ever a moment where we would read All Incomplete or any bits and pieces from All Incomplete, the ideal circumstance would be in a bar, and also drunk, you know, in a bar with our friends, with other people, and all the polite conventions of academic performance would be obliterated so that you can interrupt. If somebody says some shit that you didn't understand, you say, what are you talking about? What is that? You know, and so every word, you come across a word in a talk or in a paper and you don't understand it, the natural, process would be, wait, what? What do you mean by that? What do you, and is there a text that could be struck? It's like, people are like, why you write like that? Why you write like that? I'm doing the best I can, right? I write like that because I need some help. And the help would come in the form of you saying, excuse me, man, but what in the fuck do you mean when you right? That's it's none of it's supposed to be by itself. It doesn't work like it's confusing, right? But it also presents for us the capacity and the challenge and the chance to be confused together, right? To confuse with one another, to confound one another, you know, literally that, to confound the very idea of one and another, because we're engaged in a practice now, right? That's how it's supposed to work, you know, and just like at a show, you know, my primary experience, I didn't, you know, my first experience of poetry on a page was looking at Stevie Wonder's, you know, liner notes, where he would write the lyrics to the song. That was the first book of poetry I had, was Fulfilling This First Finale, okay, where he would put the liner notes in, put the lyrics for the song in there. And I'm like, yeah, people listen to songs all the time without knowing what all the words are, or even not just what they mean, but what even they are. You know, how many of you have ever sung a song and then you finally see the lyrics of the song, you say, wait, I was never saying that shit, I was saying this other shit, you know? So and that's all about a collective practice of listening and reading. And the reason people get so frustrated with the academy is because so much, I would call it, unnatural shit goes on there, right? And you know, well, okay, but then who makes us adhere to the unnatural? You know, because it's not just that there's unnatural shit that goes on in the academy, but the unnatural shit that goes on in the academy usually goes on in a place where if we decided to do something different, no one would know, right? No one would know. You know, just thus endeth my rant.
We're nearing the end now. And there was a question that I wanted to ask, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of the questions. They're all very rich and there's a lot of them. So thank you all for your consideration and for the non-interrupted listening in this artificial setting that we're in. There was a question I wanted to ask right at the beginning, which was from Joyce, which is how do we socialize research, and reflecting upon what I've heard, or what I think I've heard. I'd like to maybe end on a question about how do we socialize precision. I hope that's a question. I believe it to be a question.
I mean, I think it's a good enough question that we shouldn't have a ready answer for you to it. But one, I can say that one place like where I feel we are trying to do this, or at least study doing it, is in the collective, actually, that Fred and I are part of, called the Mardi Gras Listening Collective, which has sound. The Mardi Gras is just the name of the bar in Pittsburgh where we started it. It's really the jukebox that we started. And it was a matter of playing each other's songs. But the people who are in the collective, a lot of them know a lot about music. Some are DJs, some are writers, about music, etc. And this notion of precision as opposed to virtuosity comes up a lot. And the idea that what is happening with a lot of the musicians whose music is shared amongst us is that they're moving in the direction of breaking the virtuosity. In favor maybe of something like precision. And I, as maybe the member for 15 of us now, are probably the least knowledgeable formally, certainly. And I'm learning a huge amount from it's moving me away from what I had as certain kind of concepts, like virtuosity, and towards some sort of idea that there's a lot more antagonism between the musician and and the music, and most of other antagonism works itself out through the ensemble. So I guess all I want to say is that I'm kind of giving you being interested in this because there's so much more. But it's not a question I can answer.
Is that us done?
It's cool at the end of the day to kind of fade off into to fade back off into the incomprehensible, you know, to fade back off into the what Nate calls, you know, telling inarticulacy. But I think I heard what Stefano was saying about these sort of generative antagonisms, and even like generative sort of loving antagonism. Is that what you were saying, you know? And with regard to music, and I just put into the chat a link, you know, where, because it just made me think of an instance of that in this really intense way. This song by Charles Mingus called "What Love," and there's a version of it on an album of his called Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus. And there's this kind of amazing duet, or sort of, I don't know if duet's the right word. I don't think it actually is, but an instance of that kind of generative loving antagonism between him and Eric Dolphy. That's the New York noise, by the way. So you know, we're just in the noise, you know. Nothing we can do about it. But you know, eventually the Zoom thing wears down to a certain extent. Now the real question would be, if we were all in the same room, you know, on the one hand, we wouldn't have had those modes of interference and sort of feedback and you know, sort of uncontrollable accompaniment, you know, that made it difficult to hear Stefano. But all that means really is that we would need to acknowledge the necessity of producing all of that feedback and all of that complication for ourselves, right? That's the point, is, you know, that it would not be that the return to normal would be the return to the place in which it was clean, right? You know, but normal was bad, you know. So how do we bring more noise into the situation in ways that, you know, that will be generative and productive? That's really the next, you know, I don't know, man, when we get to the point where we actually are doing stuff together in the same place again, that's what we have to figure out. It's like how to facilitate that, you know, how to, you know, just to be more emphatic about inviting it, you know, about requiring it, you know, so.
Well, maybe if we're lucky, we'll get interrupted as much as Charles Olson did.
Oh man, well, that would be like, that would be when you know that you're loved, you know.
Thank you both very much. It did say in the schedule I meant to do closing remarks, but I don't want to, so I'm not going to. I don't see the point of closing remarks, so I'll cease, and I'll thank you both very much for your attention and your generosity. I'll thank Katie for organising everything, and I'll really thank all of our participants for being with us this afternoon. and for all the questions. And again, I apologise that we can't get through all of them. I know it's annoying whenever you want something answered or addressed and you don't get it. It's a bit vexing. Maybe what we could just do is we could all take our microphones off and give a little clap. Would that be a nice kind of little thing to do? Should we have a wee go at it? I'll start.
Join in the noise. Yay!
That was thrilling.